Thank you so much. You may have been waiting for this moment for quite a while. Certainly I have. And I'm not going to introduce Professor Medina properly because that will take, we only have an hour and a half. So I'll just say that he's Walter Dill Scott Professor in philosophy in the Northwestern University. He, as we all know, specializes in critical race theory, feminist and queer theory, and other areas of political and social epistemology. And his most famous book, I guess, is The Epistemology of Resistance, published in 2013. It's certainly my favorite book. And his current project, one of them at least, is the book on racial violence and epistemic activism. And we hope that you're going to share some of your ideas with us. Thanks for being here, José.
Thank you so much. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here. So thank you very, Caitlin, for organizing this. Thank you for the perseverance, the persistence. I mean, it's postponed my visit so many times since 2020, and I'm finally here, so I couldn't be happier. So thank you everybody for being here in person. Thank you the online people. I'm glad to be talking to you as well. So today I'm going to be talking about protesting under conditions of epistemic injustice. And as Mary said, this is part of my new book project. The tentative title is actually The Epistemology of Protest. And it's already under contract with Oxford University Press. So if everything goes well, it will be out next year. And I'm just giving you a taste of the book. Obviously, the project is much bigger than what I'm going to present here today. But as you can tell from the title, I'm interested in the communicative and epistemic obstacles that marginalized groups who experience epistemic injustice face when they try to protest. Okay, so that's going to be the topic. All the examples I'm going to give are about the US, so it's going to be very US centric, so sorry about that. But I'm hoping that in the discussion, people will connect some of the things I'm saying with activism and protest movements and protest acts that they're familiar with in their own context. And in fact, even though the examples I'm going to be using are mostly, not all of them, but mostly in the US, the main protest movement in the US that I'm going to be focusing on is Black Lives Matter, which of course has become a global movement. So we can talk also about that. What does it mean to engage in activism locally and globally, and how a protest movement can support the different subgroups within the movement so that they have a voice. But then also more generally, I'm going to talk about how everybody can support the voices of those who have been silenced. Whether you are a member of the marginalized group, and then it is about in-group solidarity that we're talking about, or whether you're not a member of that group, and then it is about out-group solidarity that we're talking about. And as you can see from the subtitle, different ways in which voices can be silenced, different ways in which a protesting public may not be able to develop a voice at all, or when they exercise their public voice, they are not heard properly. So I'm going to distinguish different ways in which silencing can take place. And then I'm going to suggest that we resist those forms of silencing, and we resist the forms of epistemic injustice that a protesting public can experience through a particular form of activism, which I'm going to call epistemic activism, which in a way, if you think about it, is activism about activism, right? It's a kind of meta-activism, precisely because protesting cannot happen, or protesting does happen, but it doesn't receive uptake. I'm going to suggest that something that we need to do, right, is to fight against those communicative and epistemic obstacles, to engage in forms of activism that are about the communicative and epistemic solidarity with the protesting public. And that's the main part of what I'm going to be calling epistemic activism, right? Epistemic activism is going to be about communicative and epistemic interventions that we engage in order to remove unfair communicative and epistemic obstacles, and in order to fight epistemic injustice. So the way in which I'm going to proceed is in 3 stages. So let me just very briefly tell you what these 3 parts of the talk are. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the act, the communicative act of protest, and how we can understand that act. And then I'm going to talk about the particular kind of communicative solidarity that we owe to people who try to protest and they face unfair obstacles. And I'm going to give an argument for enhanced communicative solidarity with oppressed protesting voices. Why am I saying that there's an enhanced communicative solidarity that we owe to them? Because in a way, if you share with me, which I hope everybody will, a democratic commitment, a commitment to a free and equal society in which there are democratic liberties, then in some sense, you owe some communicative solidarity to everyone, right? So that's what it means to have freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, that people can protest. And we owe, in general, some communicative solidarity to everybody who protests, in the sense that, well, we should give them attention. We should give them communicative respect. We should, if we have the time and we can, communicatively engage with them, right? So that applies to everybody. But then, of course, the argument is that if you have evidence, or if we have evidence, that people have not been heard, that people have traditionally been excluded from the public sphere, then you have an enhanced obligation to give communicative attention, communicative respect to these people. And moreover, I'm going to be arguing, whatever you think about their cause and some of their demands, and even if you don't fully agree or you haven't made up your mind, you actually owe them the solidarity, the communicative solidarity that has to do with making sure that they are heard. Even if in the end you say, but I don't fully agree, or I haven't made up my mind, or agree with some of the demands, but not others. I'm going to be arguing that you still have the obligation to express communicative solidarity with them. And that is what I'm going to be calling echoing, okay? I'll tell you more about that. But echoing has to do with expressing this kind of communicative solidarity with protesting voices so that they are heard in their own terms and they receive proper uptake. Okay, so I'll tell you more about that. And that's in the first section. In the second section, I'll make explicit the different forms of epistemic injustice that oppressed groups can face. And I'm going to connect that with an analysis of silencing that I developed through speech act theory. Okay. And then after all of that, then I'll tell you finally in the last section how to resist the different forms of silencing that protesting publics can experience. And then I'll give more content to what I call epistemic activism through equity. Okay, so first section, protest and communicative solidarity. So let me just introduce my entire analysis with this quote from Frederick Douglass, and he says, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. Why do I want to start with this quote? Because the insight that Frederick Douglass is articulating there is an insight about complicity, right? You are going to determine how much injustice there is in society if you figure out how much tolerance for injustice people are willing to have, right? And because of that, the act of protest is crucial. If you don't protest, or if you don't express solidarity with those who protest, by default, you remain complicit, you remain quiet, right? And you are tolerating the ongoing injustices, right? So what is it that we do when we protest? What kind of communicative mechanism a protest is? Well, as I already mentioned, I am developing an exhaustive account of protests in a book, in a monograph. And of course, I'm not going to go over all of that here. But clearly, there are different communicative functions that a protest may have, right? To begin with, just to express dissent, right? Even a silent protest, a silent march, a sit-in, is doing that, right? People are saying, no, we're going to take to the streets. We're going to express dissent. We're going to say, there's something wrong here. We're not going to take it, right? But then obviously, sometimes there are other things that are being done in a protest. For example, giving testimony, public testimony of experiences of injustice. People go to the public square or to the streets and they say things that are happening to them, right? Okay. And then third, and I have highlighted that because I'm going to be focusing on solidarity for the purposes of today's talk. Of course, a protest is a communicative mechanism for expressing, but also for creating, for forging solidarity. And notice, as I have it there in the 2 points, that there are at least two different kinds of solidarity that the protest may try to create, right? One is the in-group solidarity of the people affected by the injustice being protested, right? That means in a protest, you have the creation of a public voice, the creation of a public, the creation of a group of people who come together and say, no, we are against this, or we're not going to take it anymore. Why am I emphasizing this? Because in-group solidarity is crucial here, right? And in fact, notice, I'm already going to anticipate this, which is going to be one of the things I'm going to be stressing all along. If a protest, the act of protesting is blocked, what you're blocking is the creation of a collective agent. What you are doing is to precluding the existence, the formation of a collective subject, a collective agent. So in a way, to put it dramatically, you're murdering, right? You're killing, literally, a collective agent, a group that you make sure cannot have a voice, right? And notice another thing that is interesting here too. And this connects, that's why I have it in parentheses there, that this connects with the Du Boisian, W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American philosopher who wrote about everything, right? Also because he lived 90 years and he published, dozens of books. And he has a very famous essay on protest and some remarks on protest, arguing, as you may know, against Booker T. Washington. Because Booker T. Washington says things like, oh, it is actually not dignifying. Booker T. Washington was also an African-American leader, but he said, it's actually not dignifying to protest because you're begging, you are addressing the institutions or mainstream society asking for something. Okay, and of course Du Bois said, what the hell, right? He didn't say that, but he said, no, it's exactly the opposite. It is actually self-dignifying to protest. And in fact, why are you assuming that when I protest, I address first and foremost the institutions or the mainstream society? No, when we protest, we are addressing each other and we are creating a public and we're talking to each other and we're saying, no, we are together in this and we're not going to take it. And notice one thing also why this is so important for me, because as I go with my analysis, you may even wonder, oh my God, under all these conditions that Jose is talking about, people may risk their lives if they protest, right? Because they don't even live in a democracy, for example, right? And it is illegal to protest, or because they do live in a so-called democracy like the US, but under certain conditions, the tanks are on the streets, you may be killed if you protest. So in some case, and on top of that, I'm going to show you all kinds of ways in which uptake is not going to be given. So you may think, well, if I'm risking my life, no uptake is going to be given. The institutions don't care less about people protesting on the streets. Why are we protesting? And one of the reasons is, yeah, you may even know that you don't have a chance of getting proper uptake right there, right then. And it's still worth it to come together, to talk to each other, to create a protesting public. And also in some cases, you are addressing distant audiences geographically speaking, like people in other countries, people who may help you and express solidarity with you from very far away, or distant audiences in a temporal sense, like future generations. You are working for them. You are speaking and appealing to them. Okay, so all of that, which is the first point in there, right, under 3, the constitutional expression of a public. But then, of course, also, I'm not denying that another function is to try to secure public visibility and public audibility, and to garner public support, and to form alliances and all of that. And then, of course, number 4 and 5, in a protest, you also make criticisms, you articulate public critique, and you articulate demands. So all of that are things that people may not be able to do if they are not allowed to protest, or they may attempt to do if they are allowed to protest, but they may not be successful in doing because they don't receive proper uptake. And I'm going to skip this because I already told you about this, that you should be thinking about the audience of a protest in this complex way, right? Including an internal audience and including an external audience. So one thing that I want to focus on from the beginning is, what do we mean by a felicitous protest? And of course, as you can probably tell, this term, felicitous, comes from speech act theory, right?
So in a speech act theory, when we talk a particular kind of a speech act, right, that you're trying to produce, that you're trying to engage in, one question is, under what conditions is that act properly achieved? Under what conditions can we say that the act is felicitous or infelicitous? Okay, so Matthew Christman and Graham Hubbs have a really interesting and compelling paper talking about the felicity conditions of public dissent. So I'm going to use that and say that at least there are these three conditions, which are the ones that they identify. And I think there are more, but I won't bore you with those details because these conditions are already a good guide. So first, the sincerity condition, meaning by that if the people protesting they don't even believe what they're saying, then you don't have an obligation to pay attention to them, to engage with them or anything like that, because you can say, no, I have evidence that you don't even believe that the election was stolen or whatever. You don't even believe this ridiculous conspiracy theory, right? And then maybe your sincerity is in question. But even if you are sincere, you may be using the protest to manipulate the public or the institutions, or you may be instrumentalizing the protest to do something, right? To get some gain. And then if you're not making a demand in good faith, that is also a lack of felicity, an infringement on the felicity conditions. But then number three, and this is the most important of all, your protest has to be based on considerations of justice, which is not to say that you could not be wrong. Maybe you think there is an injustice and in the end there isn't. But at the very least, if we're going to be talking about a felicitous public protest, it has to be based on considerations of justice. So if you, for example, if you're just asking explicitly for privilege, for a special treatment, well, that's not a felicitous protest, right? Okay. So as they say, Christman has, as a conclusion of this, of their felicity conditions, if protesters speak insincerely, in bad faith, or not guided by considerations of justice, then their political dissent, and this part is the quote, is a bad speech act because it is conducted in a way that is self-undermining and so is infelicitous, okay? All right, so given that, what communicative obligations do we have towards protesting publics, okay? And notice, here I'm just talking about everybody who protests, whether they are members of a marginalized group or not. Well, if their protest is felicitous, we do have a prima facie obligation to hear the protest, to pay attention to them, to listen to them. And also we have at least a prima facie obligation to facilitate communicative engagement with the protest, okay? So that the protesting voices are heard, not only by us, but by other people as well, and that they are answered in one way or another. Okay. But now, and notice I just changed the top of this slide, right? What are the community obligations that we have towards suppressed protesting publics who have not been part of the public sphere in one way or another, who have been excluded or at least marginalized from the public sphere? Well, to begin with, obviously we have the same obligations, right? So the two obligations apply just the same, but we have more obligations. We have the obligation to fight against their silencing and to fight against the communicative marginalization of these groups. So notice what this means. We have an obligation, whatever the protest is about, to make sure that they are heard, to make sure that whatever silencing or epistemic maltreatment, epistemic discrimination in the communicative dynamics they face, we resist that, okay? To put it in terms of my previous book, so we have an obligation to engage in epistemic resistance, right? So that's my claim. That's going to be the main claim. Everything else is going to be a matter of detail. And I'm saying that we have a stronger form. We have an obligation to give a stronger form of communicative solidarity to these publics. And then in the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to show how we do that through epistemic activism and through the communicative mechanism that I call echoing. Okay, so this is a stronger form of communicative solidarity that we ought to oppress subjects and oppress groups involves not only giving proper uptake to their acts. So it's not only the case that I'm claiming you have to give proper uptake to them. Secondly, you have to facilitate the proper uptake of others. Meaning, if the institutions of your society are not giving proper uptake, you have to put pressure on those institutions so that they give proper uptake. If there are other collectives, other groups in society, and also other institutions like the media, let's say, who are not giving proper uptake, you have an obligation to fight for securing that proper uptake. So if the media is not covering the protest, right, you have an obligation to say, hey, this is happening in our society, you have to pay attention to it. Or if the media is giving coverage, but it's totally distorting what the protest is about, you also have an obligation to say, no, that's not what this protest is about. Okay. And I'm going to suggest that one way, it's only a minimal way, actually, there is a longer story to be told here, but at least one way in which you can do that to begin with is by echoing the protest, as a felicitous protest, if it is, and by echoing the content of the protest, the demands, the criticisms, and so on, so that they are heard in a proper way. Okay. So when an oppressed public tries to protest under conditions of communicative marginalization, facilitating proper uptake involves fighting against silencing and contributing to the communicative empowerment of marginalized voices. Notice how important this is. A lot of the epistemic activism that goes on in social movements, in what we call activism in general, has to do with empowerment, right? The self-empowerment of the group itself. That's what the protest is about. But also, even if you're not a member of the protesting public, if you try to facilitate their uptake and give solidarity to them, that's also part of what you're trying to do. You're trying to empower their voices, right? And facilitate the exercise of their epistemic capacities. Okay, so how do we give proper uptake? So this is just my own notion of uptake in general, right? How do we give proper uptake? I'm claiming that it involves the recognition, the proper recognition of the communicative intention, the locutionary force of the act, but it also involves recognizing the communicative content of the act, what we call the locutionary content. So what that means is that you need to have at least a minimal understanding of the act, right? But then I go even beyond that. So my notion of uptake is more robust than other notions that are available. I claim that giving proper uptake involves also recognizing the possible consequences, the possible communicative effect that protesting could have, the perlocution, okay? This is just giving proper uptake. I haven't gotten to echoing yet. So when you notice that proper uptake is not secure, people try to protest, but they are not perceived as trying to protest. Their communicative intention is not properly recognized, or the content of their protest is not properly recognized, or the intended effects of the protest are not properly recognized. Then what do? You try to promote the proper uptake, and you engage in the promotion of communicative solidarity and in epistemic activism through echo, okay? And this may involve at least these three things. First, promoting the proper recognition of the communicative act as an act of protest. Secondly, promoting, and do I have, oh no, I have that together. Okay, secondly, promoting the proper recognition of the content, the locutionary content of the act. And third, promoting the proper recognition of the intended consequences of the act. And of course, we can talk about those forms of echoing as illocutionary echoing, locutionary echoing, or perlocutionary echoing, okay? Even if this is technical language that is new to you because you are not familiar with the speech theory, don't be too preoccupied with that. Don't worry about that. I think it will become clear as I go, okay? So second section of the paper in which I'm gonna give my own analysis of epistemic injustice and silencing as they relate to protest. So first, I'm gonna actually skip this. Just remember Miranda Frica's notion of epistemic injustice and the two main varieties that we've been talking about for these 2 days. I don't need to go into that. But what I will say, going into the next slide, is that there are important expansions of this, right, that are crucial for the analysis that I'm going to provide today. Specifically, there is an expansion about hermeneutical injustice, right, that I'm going to build on. As you know, and this has come up in our discussions already, for Miranda Frica, hermeneutical injustice happens when people don't have the necessary hermeneutical resources, right? To articulate an experience, to make themselves understood. Other people, including myself, have said, no, that's too narrow. That's only part of the story, because some people sometimes do have the hermeneutical resources, but they cannot use them. They are blocked. When they try to use them, the exercise, the application of those resources is blocked. So Gail Polhouse, with the notion of willful hermeneutical ignorance among the people, and also beyond that, even if they are allowed to use them, they don't receive the proper uptake, right? Okay, I'm gonna include all of that, as you will see, but I'm gonna go even beyond that. So there are two additions that to this that I'm interested in highlighting, two expansions of the framework. The first one concerns hermeneutical injustice, that it is not only about unfair intelligibility deficits, right? Notice that everything I have said up to this point, you can understand in terms of unfair intelligibility deficits. You are not making sense to them, either because because the language is not available, for example, or because a language is available, but it can't be used, or it is used, but people are like, I still don't understand what this means. I still don't understand what you're saying. All of that can come under the category of you're not making sense, or you're making defective sense, right? Intelligibility deficit. I'm going even beyond that. I'm saying, in some cases, you can express yourself in any way you like, and people claim that they understand you, so they assign intelligibility to you. So they claim you're making sense. But you receive the kind of uptake in which you are making sense, but not the sense that you want to make. You're making some sense to them, but the sense that they make of you is actually not at all the sense that you want to make of yourself. In fact, very often, the sense that they're making, the meaning that they're assigning to you, the intelligibility that they assign to you, goes against what you want to say. It undermines your progress. So think about co-optation, right? Misinterpretation. Even outside protest, if you want to think about this in other ways, right? Well, the problems of paraphrasing, this came up yesterday, right? With Milan's talk about metaphors. Even paraphrasing a metaphor, not undermining the intelligibility of the metaphor, but just putting it in literal language, could actually be a manipulation that is counterproductive and perpetuates a hermeneutical injustice. Or even what we do with all our best intentions when we teach. Very often we paraphrase what our students say, right? Even sometimes a great paraphrase that the students is like, oh my God, did I say that? Right? But notice how dangerous that is. Sometimes you're losing part of the meaning, sometimes the complete meaning of what the person was trying to say. So there are forms of uptake that clearly give intelligibility to the communicative act, but the intelligibility that it gives is so precarious that you're really manipulating the content of the act, right? And therefore, I'm claiming there is an unfair hermeneutical treatment, right? Because your meaning is being blocked. You are being perceived as meaningful, but your original meaning or your intended meaning or your self-interpretation is being blocked, right? And I'm going to claim, as you will see, that even some of the famous responses in the US to Black Lives Matter, like All Lives Matters, is a subtle way of doing that. It's not saying you're not making sense, but they're saying, oh, you're making sense, but all lives matters. Don't say Black Lives Matter, because all lives matters, right? As if you were saying something that is intentional with that. So we'll get to that. So that is one of the ways in which I'm going to expand the notion of hermeneutical injustice. But even more importantly, there is a third notion of epistemic injustice that I'm going to focus on, which is agential epistemic injustice. In a way, it is a new notion in the sense that we have been, my colleague Jennifer Lackey and myself have been using this new notion, agential epistemic injustice, in the recent literature, in recent publications. But in a way, if you remember, if you follow this literature on epistemic injustice from the beginning, in a way, it was there from the beginning in some of the criticisms of Miranda Fricker, because even Christopher Hookway, for example, said, wait, there are only two varieties of epistemic injustice, testimonial and hermeneutic, as if in knowledge producing and knowledge sharing practices, we only did two things. giving testimony and interpreting or making sense? And he was like, well, of course we give testimony and we interpret, we make sense, we do that, but we also ask questions. We also challenge and come up with counterexamples. We try to justify, we try to explain, we do all these different things. And people can be epistemically marginalized, epistemically excluded, or epistemically oppressed when they try to do any of these things. Right? So the general notion here is, if your epistemic agency is unfairly treated, for example, if your epistemic agency is blocked so that you cannot exercise it, or you exercise your epistemic agency, but it is diminished, or marginalized, or co-opted, or subverted, all those instances are forms of agential epistemic injustice. And it is true that in some cases when this happens, there is also at the same time testimonial injustice or hermeneutical injustice. But that's okay. The more general phenomenon that is important to identify is agential epistemic injustice. And my colleague Jennifer Lackey and myself have been using this very actively in our analysis of epistemic injustices in the American criminal justice system. So as you probably know, within the American criminal justice system, whether you are in jail or without being convicted yet, or in prison after conviction, there are all kinds of things that you simply cannot do. Even in some cases, giving testimony, but also you cannot criticize the institution, you cannot ask questions, you cannot file a grievance. I mean, you cannot gather. People cannot gather in the halls because that's suspect criminal activity or gang activity. So these are ways of blocking epistemic agency. And then when people try to do epistemic things like sharing their experiences, then there are obstructions. And then when they do protest in prison, like, which is what I'm going to focus on, then their attempts to protest become something else, not recognized as a protest, or the content of their protest is distorted. So all of these are forms of agential epistemic injustice. Okay. So what are the epistemic injustices against protesting voices? Well, of course, testimonial injustices are crucial, right? People try to give testimony, for example, of racist policing. People of color take to the streets saying, I have been discriminated against by the police. And they encounter distrust. So that's testimonial injustice. Hermeneutical injustices of all the different forms that I just gave you, when the interpretation of the protest it becomes defective in one way or another because of unfair interpretations, and in particular because the protesters' self-interpretation is blocked. But then also there are agential epistemic injustices. People are prevented from protesting in the first place, or the protest is obstructed, or the protesters' abilities to contribute to social meanings and social knowledge encounters unfair obstacles, okay? So there are all those different forms, I mean, these three in particular, right, of epistemic injustice. Now what I'm going to try to do is to connect that, right, those three forms of epistemic injustice with the different ways in which the attempt to protest can be silenced, okay? And I'm going to use a speech act theory for this. But again, if you're not familiar with it, I hope I will say enough so that you will not be lost. In general, so I'm going to just tell you from the beginning what my diagnostic framework is and the 4 types of silencing that I want to identify. So first, pre-locutionary silencing, okay? And my autocorrect in the word processor keeps saying, no, pre-locutionary, you mean per-locutionary. No. I do mean pre-locutionary. Yeah, I know it's not a word, but that's what I mean. Why? Because there is a kind of silencing, which is preemptive silencing, that happens even before you attempt to protest. So this is a silencing that I'm claiming is taking place already before the act of protesting, before the locution, right? And I'll tell you more about that case, how that can happen, right? But then secondly, I'm going to say, even if you can protest, so the locution does take place, right? If you are protesting on the streets, but people look at you and they think you're engaged in criminal activity, for example, then there is illocutionary silencing. You are not being perceived as a protester, right? Black Lives Matter, right? In some instances, people claim that they are rioting. and looting, or people claim, oh, they are not protesting, they are threatening the public or threatening the institutions, or they are intimidating the police. That's a way of illocutionary silencing the act of protest. Okay, but think about this. There is no pre-locutionary silencing, you do protest. There is no illocutionary silencing. Everybody, the media, the institutions look at you and they are protesting. I'm claiming that even in that case, it's still possible for protesting voices to be silenced if what they're actually saying and trying to say and their own self-interpretation doesn't go through. If the content of the protest is not heard. I'm claiming that is also a form of silence, okay? Okay, and at this point you may say, well, that's enough, right? If you are protesting and you're being recognized as protesting and there is minimal understanding of the content of your protest, you cannot be silenced anymore, right? I'm claiming that there is a fourth kind of silencing, which I'm going to call perlocutionary silencing, which is, yes, you have been recognized as protesting and there is minimal understanding of your protest, but now the possible consequences, the communicative and epistemic consequences of your act of protest are undermined in such a way that your protest becomes ineffective, doesn't carry any weight in public life. It cannot be taken into consideration, right? Then in that case, I'm claiming there is perlocutionary silencing. Okay, let me tell you just a little bit more about each. Pre-locutionary silencing, the preemptive kind. Well, of course, it can happen through explicit prohibitions. So, right? So clearly, non-democratic regimes that prohibit freedom of assembly or freedom of speech, they are engaging in pre-locutionary silence. Okay, but I'm claiming also that even in democracies in which there is no de jure prohibition or legal constraints on protesting, there could be and there very often are communicative environments and epistemic climates in which protesting voices are inhibited. People feel threatened not to protest or intimidated not to protest. So for example, this kind of case in the US, right? When the tanks take to the streets when a protest has been called. It's a way of intimidating the public, right? And there's an entire history of this. And I had actually dozens of images of the civil rights movement in which, police was taking the town in which a protest was gonna take place. So you are already intimidating the public so that they don't take to the streets. Okay, so in those cases, what is happening is that the prelocutionary silencing results in agential epistemic injustice, okay? The epistemic agency of the protesters is blocked. They cannot protest. Okay, now how about the locutionary silencing? How is it that the communicative force of the act of protesting, the locutionary force, can be nullified, can be neutralized? How is that done? Well, in the US, in many ways, obviously, there is only just one way, but the most obvious ways in which that has been done, for example, in the US, and there is a long history of this, is the rhetorical frame of criminality, of rioting and looting. Especially people of color have had a hard time taking to the streets and protesting, because as soon as they do that, they say that's a mob, that's a riot, that is a bunch of criminals, right? So there are many examples, but recent ones include the LA uprising in 1992, when people took to the streets with the exoneration of the police officers who brutally beat up Mr. Rodney King, right? And people took to the streets. The LA uprising was depicted by the media, by all media, not only conservative media, liberal media as well, as a riot, okay? Even the Ferguson protests in 2016, especially at the beginning, were depicted as the Ferguson riots. And it's actually very interesting that it was in the spring, late spring of 2020, right? That for the first time, because I was already working on this and tracking this, it was for the first time in the late spring of 2020 that Wikipedia decided to change these entries. There was no entry for Wikipedia for the LA uprising, only the LA riots. There was no entry for the Ferguson protests, only for the Ferguson riots. So why was that they decided to do that? Well, clearly Black Lives Matter, the uprising of 2020, was getting a lot of social recognition and acceptability And at some point, Wikipedia thought, well, we can't keep saying, right, that these were only riots. There was something else going on as well. But notice how interesting this is, because this suggests that illocutionary silencing can happen simultaneously with the protest, contemporaneously with the protest, as the protest takes place. Some people could say that's not a protest, that's a riot. But notice also that it can happen in the communicative afterlife of the protest. Years later, decades later, when that is not remembered as a protest, but is remembered as a riot, okay? And then of course we have this famous example, which is Donald Trump saying in May 28th, 2020, when people were taken, right after the police murder of George Floyd, when people were taken to the streets in Minneapolis, he said famously, "These facts are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. When the looting starts, the shooting starts." So notice how here he's inviting American audiences, and audiences everywhere, to illocutionary silence the protest. He's inviting people to think about the protesters as facts and as engaging in looting, so that they should be treated as criminals and looters, right? Notice also another thing. Everybody knew, right? We all knew that this was only the beginning, that there was going to be a proliferation of protest the next day, the next week, right? So in a way, he's not only inviting people to illocutionary silence protest, he's also engaging in pre-locutionary silencing of future protests. Meaning by that, he was warning the public, don't do this. Don't come out to the streets in other cities tomorrow or next week, because the tanks will be there. Okay, we can think about, and I'll try to go faster so that we have plenty of time for the Q&A. This can happen in different ways. In fact, there are two different models of thinking about illocutionary silencing. One is illocutionary disablement. People become disabled, communicatively speaking, so that they cannot do certain acts. And this is what Ray Lanton and Jennifer Hornsby talk about when they talk about illocutionary silencing. In a way, when you think about this model, it's like you try to say something, you try to engage in a communicative act, and you are perceived as doing something that is not even communicative, right? Rioting, for example. You're making noises, you're doing stuff, right? But the second model is even better because it enables us to see something that happens very often. The second model comes from discursive injustice, Quill Kukla, right? And their account of discursive injustice. And it's used by a bunch of people, including Lubell Anderson, and what is called illocutionary flipping is part of discursive injustice. What it means is, when you try to say something or engage in a communicative act, right? Sometimes, like for example, in the feminist literature, trying to refuse sexual advances. Sometimes your act of refusal, saying no, or saying stop. Right? No, it's illocutionary silence, not only in the sense that people don't hear what you're saying and it becomes noise. Sometimes people hear something completely different from what you're trying to say. Your act of refusal, for example, becomes something else. Like, for example, when it is eroticized, according to some pornographic narratives or whatever, it is heard, or it could be heard, as playing a game, or playing hard to get, or playing not as an act of refusal. So you're heard as doing something communicatively that is very different from what you wanted to do. And that's illocutionary flipping. And I think that's actually more useful for our purposes, because that happens a lot in the illocutionary silencing of protesting. Okay, so Quill Kukla says discursive injustice occurs, quote, when members of a disadvantaged group face a systematic inability to produce a specific kind of a speech act that they are entitled to perform. And in particular, when their attempts result in their actually producing a different kind of a speech act that further compromises their social position and agency. So when you apply this to protest, the question is, in some cases, members of a disadvantaged group, like for example, in the US, people of color, are systematically prevented from producing certain speech acts like protesting. Why? Because when they try to do so, they are perceived as doing something entirely different from what they are trying to do. So they are perceived as rioting or looting or threatening the public instead of protesting. Okay, so from this, just like in the previous case, from illocutionary silencing, what we get is agential epistemic injustice, I'm claiming. Okay, how about locutionary silencing? That involves all other things as well, but it involves semantic blocking or semantic distortion. So the manipulation of the content of the protest. So for example, when Black Lives Matter is interpreted, misinterpreted, distorted as suggesting only Black Lives Matters, and then people respond, all lives matters. Now notice that here, what is happening is not a communicative nullification of the act. It's not that you are not protesting anymore, but you are protesting infelicitously. If the communicative act of protest becomes downgraded, right? So the result is a hermeneutical injustice against protesters. And I mean, I can tell you more about this. I'm going to go faster because I want to save time for the last section. But Lubel Anderson, for example, has an entire semantic analysis of how the self-interpretation of the protesters when they say Black Lives Matter gets blocked. And that's an inclusive interpretation. They're saying against the background of the history of racism in this country, against the background of Black lives not having mattered, we say Black Lives Matters, right? Which doesn't exclude white lives mattering or brown lives mattering, but that gets blocked, and then there is the imposition, right, of an exclusive interpretation saying, no, they are really saying only Black lives matters. Okay. So finally, perlocutionary silencing, that has to do with cutting off the protest from its communicative consequences, right? So that the protest doesn't carry any weight in public life. And that can be done in various ways. This is kind of a very obvious way, right? When people are forced to protest in far away places where the press is not going to get, where most people are not going to hear your protest, so that your protest is clearly going to be ineffectual, right? So in the US, for example, especially with the George W. Bush administration and Condoleezza Rice, they created freedom of speech zones, right? Which is, I mean, we can get back to this because this is really interesting. Right? But there is such a thing as a zone in which there is freedom of speech as opposed to the rest. But freedom of speech zones very typically are in these far removed parking lots where you can protest to your heart's content, right? And there you have a bunch of us, right? This was when I was at Vanderbilt and Condoleezza Rice came to give the commencement speech and we were protesting, and then we were taken to these buses, right, by the Nashville police and the federal police to these parking lots, right? So clearly that's a problem, right? But even when that doesn't happen in that obvious way, there are ways in which the communicative afterlife of a protest can be obstructed, right? So that the demands of the protest, the path towards the rectification of the injustice being protested, become blocked, right? I'm claiming that, for example, the demands of Black Lives Matter are perlocutionary silence when people in the American media and in American politics depict these demands as being non-actionable. Well, sometimes they depict them as being unintelligible or unimaginable. So I'm talking about abolish the police, defund the police, things like that. Sometimes they say that doesn't even make sense. That would be hermeneutical injustice. But other times they say, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but that is not public policy. That's not actionable. So we're not going to take it into account. But in fact, if you look just online, the Movement for Black Lives, right, the website, and you go to visions, right, the visions for Black Lives, you will see under defunding the police, under abolishing the police, action items, one by one. So for example, under abolishing the police, taking the police out of educational institutions, out of high schools, for example, so that you stop the pipeline from delinquency in high school to the prison system. Well, that's, I mean, you may disagree with the proposal, but that is an action item. So how can you say, no, we're not going to take it into account because it's not actionable? And notice in the US, the DOJ report on the Baltimore police, the DOJ report on the Ferguson police, the Department of Justice report on the Chicago police, none of those reports address Black Lives Matter and their demands, right? So how is it that there can be this vibrant protest movement and the institutions feel, we don't need to talk to you, we don't need to address your demands, we are not going to communicatively engage with you? And then when you put pressure on them and say, no, we have been protesting on the streets for years, you do have to, they would say, no, but what you're saying is not actionable, right? Okay, so that's, in my view, perlocutionary silencing. And this leads to, this perlocutionary silencing, to agential epistemic injustice, but also in some cases to testimonial injustices and hermeneutical injustice. So this is the summary of this entire section, right? You can see the different kinds of silencing listed, and then next to them, the different kinds of epistemic injustice that result from them. And I'm saying, as a conclusion of this part, that of course, resisting silencing of protesting voices is part of the audience's responsibility to give proper uptake. Not only do you have to give proper uptake, you have to facilitate the uptake of others, and that means resisting silencing. And if you don't do this, right, I'm claiming, when individuals, publics, and institutions don't engage in epistemic resistance and don't actively fight against silencing, then they become complicit. And they become either passive bystanders who tolerate, for example, the silencing of Donald Trump, right? Or in some cases, they may become active enablers of this silencing if they actually recirculate these scripts or contribute to the circulation of these scripts. Okay, just finally, and I'll summarize this part so that we get to the Q&A. Let me just say briefly how to resist silencing and the different forms of epistemic injustice that result from silencing. Okay, epistemic activism through echoing. So I'm going to follow just the fourfold distinction that I gave you about different kinds of silencing to talk about the different ways in which silencing can be resisted. So I'm going to be talking about resisting pre-locutionary silencing, and then resisting elocutionary silencing, and there I'm going to be talking about echoing, elocutionary echoing, resisting locutionary silencing, and there I'm going to be talking about locutionary echoing, and then finally resisting perlocutionary silencing, perlocutionary echoing. So first, how do you resist pre-locutionary silencing? How do we all do that, right? Given that I'm claiming we have an obligation to do that, to fight against perlocutionary silencing, we have an obligation to denounce prohibitions and constraints on protest, right? And again, this goes not only for the kind of epistemic resistance that needs to happen in dictatorial regimes, it also goes for the limitations in formal constraints on freedom of assembly and freedom of speech in democracies. We have to fight against inhibitory communicative climates in which people they face all kinds of obstacles when they try to protest. And then finally here, which is a very important point, we have to proactively create opportunity to protest, communicative and epistemic opportunities to protest, even under the worst conditions, even when there are communicative dysfunctions and epistemic dysfunctions, and you know how hard it is to protest. And notice one thing that is really interesting about the last point. A lot of activism, a lot of protest movements and grassroots activism that happens is really very creative and inventive so that they can protest and they are heard and they receive some media attention, even when it is illegal to protest, even when they're going to be removed from the streets by the police, even when they are in prison, which in the US is one of the hardest cases you can imagine, right? When you lose your civil liberties, even in jail, even before you're convicted, you lose your civil liberties. There are all kinds of things you cannot do in the prisons, in the American prison system, and you cannot protest. And yet, there is such thing as prison protest. How do they do it, right? So they invent ways in which they can reconfigure the social space in which they live, in this case, prison. And they can reconfigure social practices that are allowed, that are not protesting, and they become protest. Let me show you an example, not from prison, although I have that too. First, from a famous protest that happened during the Argentinian dictatorship, the junta, in the 70s. So, as you may know, even though most of you were not even born then, but you may have heard about this, right, during the military dictatorship in Argentina, people, especially protesters, actually, activists, were being kidnapped and tortured and even killed. People were not speaking publicly about it because they were not allowed to, right? Because you could not protest. So some of the mothers of these victims said, okay, we cannot do a march because that's illegal, but we can walk in the park because that's still legal. We're going to take a leisure activity, walking in the park, and we're going to transform that into a protest. We can do a sitting just anywhere because that's illegal, but we can sit in a bench in a park and just stay there. Right? So that's exactly what they did, right? So I have an image there from, and not only they did that in a park, they did that in the park in front of the presidential palace, in front of the Casa Rosada. So they kept walking around the park, right? And of course, that was a protest, right? And that received so much attention. And of course, they were not so naive as to say, oh yeah, the military junta is going to change their mind and they're going to come out tomorrow and say, oh yeah. Here are your children or the corpses of your children. They knew that, but they knew they could get attention, national attention, international attention. And as you probably know, because they received so much attention, they were removed from the park. Right? And at that point, the military junta said, no more parks, no more walking in the park or sitting in the park. That is not allowed. So what did the mothers do? What did the mothers do? They said, okay, what is it still allowed to do? Religious activity, pilgrimages. So they crashed the next party, right? So they went to a religious pilgrimage. The annual pilgrimage of the Nuestra Señora de Luján, Our Lady of Luján, and they just walk in the pilgrimage by wearing their children's nappies, and then they turn that into a protest, right? That is resisting pre-locutionary silencing. And I had also, that's this slide, right? A whole account of how incarcerated subjects do something similar in prison. Namely, they do things so that they can protest in prison, even though they are not allowed to protest in prison. And they do another thing, I'll just mention this and move on. They do another thing that is really interesting, which is they cannot form groups or collectives or do things together because because it is explicitly prohibited, because that is considered criminal activity or gang activity. But they coordinate in such a way that they do form collective agents and they develop collective agency. So for example, individuals can file grievances. So what they do is, we're going to file a collective grievance, which we cannot do, but we're going to coordinate so that we do it together, right? And I have an entire study of that in the 2021 article in Social Epistemology, if you're interested, or later on I can tell you more about that. Prison protest, okay. So how do we resist illocutionary silencing? In many ways, but one way is through counter speech. So the idea is that if there is a silencing speech, right, like the one of Donald Trump, or in general, the rioting and looting framework, you have to actively fight against that silencing speech with counter speech. And for example, Ray Lanter and Laura Capone have an account of engaging in counter speech by blocking presuppositions of the silencing speech. And they are talking about interpersonal dynamics, and they're not talking about protests actually. But I'm applying this to protests and say that we can do this. We can block the presuppositions of a silencing speech, right? And for example, we can say to the American criminal justice system, why are you assuming that incarcerated subjects cannot talk to each other or that they cannot gather? It's only, that makes sense only if you assume that they are criminals and they are engaging in criminal activity as soon as they gather. But that is a problematic presupposition. So you can engage in that kind of counter speech. But also more generally, you can engage in what I'm calling illocutionary echoing, which is simply say, no, these people are protesters. They are not criminals. They are not rioting and looting, right? That's illocutionary echoing. Okay, how do you resist locutionary echoing? Well, part of this is just fighting distortions, fighting propaganda. So the work of Jason Stanley is relevant here. Also, what is called ideology critique could be a form of epistemic resistance against locutionary silencing. But also, it could consist in compensating for the deficits in intelligibility of protesting voices, so that you say, no, try to engage with them in their own terms. If the response is all lives matters, because they're saying only Black lives matters, you say no, but that they claim they're saying something else. Let's look at their self-interpretation of the protest. And that, of course, connects directly with locutionary echoing. right? You're echoing the protesters' self-interpretation. And how do you engage in resisting perlocutionary silencing? Well, making sure that protest can lead to communicative consequences, also holding society and its institutions accountable to protesting publics. If the media, if the justice system, if the government are not paying attention or engaging with demands, right, with the consequences, the intended consequences of the protest, you should say, no, you have to engage, right? You have to hold accountable your society and your institutions, and that involves, for example, perlocutionary echoing the calls for reparative measures and steps towards rectification of the injustice being protested. For example, what I was telling you earlier about the misinterpretations of police abolition or police defunding, you can say, well, no, but it's not true that these are not non-actionable proposals. Okay, so let me just conclude. Well, I mean, this is just a way of summarizing echoing, right? The different forms of echoing that you can engage in, promoting proper recognition of the elocutionary force, the communicative intention, or the communicative content, or the communicative consequences of the act of protest. Okay, conclusions. So first, I'm claiming that we have a prima facie obligation to give proper uptake to felicitous progress. That was from the beginning what I was trying to convince you of. But then more importantly, I'm arguing that when protesting voices have been communicatively excluded or communicatively marginalized, they have been silenced in one way or another, then they deserve special attention, special communicative respect, and special communicative solidarity. And that we can give that special attention, respect, and solidarity through echoing. And then to put all of that in epistemic terms, the point is that in order to resist the epistemic marginalization of silenced publics, in order to resist epistemic injustice, we have a shared responsibility to promote the proper uptake of their protest acts. So in general, what I'm trying to convince you of is that resisting the epistemic and communicative marginalization of oppressed protesting public is a shared obligation that we all have, that we can discharge through echoing of these different forms. So I'll stop there, keep your coins, I won't change in that famous image by Maxi. Thank you so much.